I'll get started today. Welcome everyone to Capital Institute's mini workshop on regenerative economics and course preview for our upcoming cohort of the Introduction to Regenerative Economics course. My name is Tay and I'm here on the Capital Institute team. We're a think tank dedicated to bringing regenerative economics and finance to life. I'm joining this conversation today from British Columbia on the beautiful Salt Spring Islands. And for those of you who haven't caught on to the trend in the chat yet, feel free to please introduce yourself, where you're calling in from, your name, what brought you here, etc. It's so great to see so many familiar faces from our course community. We're celebrating nearly 1,000 alumni coming into this next cohort. So I want to also extend a warm welcome to anyone who's joining us here for the first time. Our invitation to each of you today is to join us on a bit of a journey to reimagine our economy as a living system, which John is going to be guiding us through shortly. We're also going to be diving into what you can expect from the fall cohort of our internationally acclaimed Introduction to Regenerative Economics online course that begins on September 18th. And the conversation today is going to be a 60-minute event. There will be time at the end for Q&A, and the whole thing will be recorded, so that will be shared out for anyone who couldn't join us live here today. But before we jump in to ground us for today, I wanted to share a little excerpt from Finding the Mother Tree. It's a lovely memoir by Canadian forest ecologist Suzanne Simard. This book is really a recounting of Suzanne's life's work understanding trees as part of our interconnected system of life. And it's brought me a lot of inspiration during my time here on Salt Spring Island, in this community that's battled really bravely and victoriously against the extractive logging industry. And so I thought that that could set a tone for us today as we spend the next 60 minutes reimagining a less extractive economic system. And that excerpt goes, we can continue pushing our Earth out of balance with greenhouse gases accelerating each year, or we can regain balance by acknowledging that if we harm one species, one forest, one lake, this ripples through the entire complex web. Mistreatment of one species is mistreatment of all. The rest of the planet has been waiting patiently for us to figure that out. Making this transformation requires that humans reconnect with nature, the forest, the prairie, the oceans, instead of treating everything and everyone as objects for exploitation. And she goes on to speak about this crossroads that we're at, and this invitation to reconnect, and an invitation to rate our relationship to living systems, to acknowledge that humanity is an integral part of the web of life. You know, there's no separation between us and it. And I feel that that's very similar to this crossroads that we're at within our economic systems, our social systems, you know, all of them. You know, in fact, that's a key premise of Principle 1, right relationship, within the 8 principles of regenerative economics that John, I'm sure, will be diving into in a bit. So I just invite each of you to pause for a moment and reflect on how you want to connect with this shift towards regenerative economics. You know, what's giving you energy about this transformation? What are you wanting to connect more within? What are you curious about? What really brought you here today? Wonderful. Well, with that, I'm going to pass it over to you, John. You know, I'm sure John doesn't need an introduction for this crowd, but John has really dedicated his life for the last decade to exploring regenerative economics and finance and developing frameworks to support economic transformation. And I think most notably, you know, the 8 principles of regenerative economics and finance that we'll talk about today. So it's really been such an honor to work with you, John, on bringing this theory to life. And you know, I'm probably not the first one to say it, but John really is an artist, bringing new ideas, new paradigms, new frameworks to life. And so I'm just excited to share that with you all today. So over to you, John. Thanks and welcome again, everyone.
Thank you, Tay. That's I hope someday they put artist on my tombstone. That would be that'd be better than banker, I suppose. So welcome, everyone. It's really great to see such a good turnout and many more who have signed up, and then hopefully we'll hear the recording. I have a presentation that I'll walk through just to keep myself on track and get through it efficiently, so we can have a conversation at the end. But it's been quite a summer with climate, and each time we begin to get ready to run this course, this will now be the 4th cohort. I sort of show up with this feeling like I no longer need to explain why we need to talk about this. And I think this summer was, or it still is, the fires are burning out of control in Greece, I read this morning, but it seems like it's a watershed moment on the climate side. I happened to watch our political debate, if that's what you want to call it, last night of the Republican Party, and it's certainly a watershed event in the United States on the political front. It's just extraordinary what's happening, and so I think we're all searching for a way to make some sense out of all this. And if I've done one thing well, it's realizing, somehow intuiting that this was coming a long time ago when I left Wall Street. And honestly, I've been wrestling my brain with trying to make sense of not only what's happening, but what we can do about it ever since. And so that's what this course is about. It is a course on economics, and not because I'm passionate about economics, but because the economy, the global economy, is really the water we're all swimming in, and it is the system that is generating all of the symptoms that we call problems that we try to solve. So I don't think anyone can avoid getting informed and educated and thoughtful about our economic system. It's not something to be left to the economists by any means. So with that as a brief intro, let's get to it here. Is that working?
Yep. Okay,
good. So here we are in the workshop, and what I'm probably most focused on and proud at the response is that this course is helping people see what everyone sees, but in a new way. And I think that's what distinguishes this course and our approach from all of the sustainability work that's happening. And it's certainly my goal is to give us a fresh lens to look at this crisis in a new way, and hopefully in a more accurate way, and give us some new insight, literally insight into what's happening and what how we need to respond to that. And this term, the poly crisis, now I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with it, but it's a good word. I remember meeting with Dennis Meadows probably 15 years ago. Dennis was one of the co-authors of Limits to Growth. And we were in a small workshop, and someone asked him, when will we know we're in collapse? And he said, the first thing that will go will be our ability to cope. And it feels like we're beginning to lose our ability to cope as these interconnected political, social, economic, financial, health, both physical and mental health, as well as the many ecological crises, climate being just one symptom, are sort of cascading now out of control. And we're realizing that they're all connected, but it's left us at a loss for what to do about it, at least if we think about it seriously. And of course, then in our politics here in the United States, one of the leading Republican candidates proudly claimed last night in a debate, that climate change is a hoax. And he's all for burning more fossil fuels, digging more coal, and fracking away. So we're, I'm sure everyone that's in this conversation today is not questioning whether climate change is a hoax, but we are in a little bit still in a bubble here, at least in the United States, where despite the facts and looking out the window, we're not even at the very basic level of understanding what's happening. So, Thomas Berry is one of my teachers. I unfortunately never got to know the man, but his writings are brilliant and prophetic, and I encourage anyone who's interested to look them up. Particularly, the book I love the most is a book called The Great Work, and I do think that this work that we're all a part of is part of the great work of our era, not just our generation, but our multi-generation era that is living on this planet at this time. And Barry wrote that we're in trouble because we don't have a good story. We're in between stories. And my hope is that this living systems paradigm is a new story that we can, that will resonate with not just us on this call, but the broad majority of humanity, or at least a significant minority, which will again change the way we see what we describe as problems today. So how did we get here? Well, there's a long story, and I've chosen to pick up the story at the beginning of the scientific revolution. The history or the roots of the story date prior to that. If I had to pick one moment, it would probably be the rise of patriarchy, which coincided with the rise of agriculture. But the last shift in eras from the medieval era to the modern era certainly has had a profound impact in explaining how we got where we are today. And with that was basically began the rise of what I'll call the Church of Economic Growth as the God we bow down to. We in any aspect of business or politics have an unquestioned assumption, and I'm sure this isn't true for many of us on this call, but in general, we have this unquestioned assumption that economic growth is the source of our future prosperity. And it was only accelerated post-World War II as a logical strategy to keep us from killing each other as we fought for land and stuff. But if we can have exponential growth, we don't have to fight over stuff. We can create more stuff. But the roots of it go back long before World War II. And it's an interesting intellectual study. But the fundamental premise that exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is, as Kenneth Boulding said, either the thought of a madman or an economist. And it literally is the assumption of neoclassical economics. And it continues to be the assumption of neoclassical economics that is taught in every major university around the world today. And that may seem trivial, but I would suggest it's profoundly important that this unquestioned assumption be wrestled with and all of its implications processed. But as I said, the original era of economics goes back to the scientific revolution. Copernicus's hypothesis that the Earth is not the center of the universe, but in fact the sun is at the center and the Earth is one planet revolving around the sun. That was rejected, or the evidence that the Earth was not the center of the universe was wrestled with for 1,000 years before Copernicus came along. And the astronomers came up with explanations, theories, patches to the theory that explained why the planets would wobble as they rotated around, supposedly rotated around the Earth. But Copernicus changed all that, and out of the scientific revolution, the first major academic treatise was published by Newton, and but something else happened right around that same time, and for me personally, this is very, very profound, because I had no idea when I moved to a little town called Stonington, Connecticut, in the eastern corner of Connecticut, that Mystic, which is the bigger town near us on the border of Stonington, actually part of it is in Stonington, is where the Mystic Massacre happened. And the Mystic Massacre was literally the first genocide in North America that took place, and opened up a series of genocides that, despite or in addition to the moral atrocity that it and they were, it also essentially ensured that we would ignore indigenous wisdom. And we're waking up to the reality today that much indigenous wisdom, not just in North America, but around the world, somehow the indigenous people intuited what we need to actually understand today. And I'm not at all going to speak for indigenous wisdom, but I can't help but observe the alignment of our living systems scientific approach to economics with what the principles and the ethics of indigenous wisdom have stood for literally all of humanity. Now, I point to the beginning of the scientific revolution, and there's a long story for this, but just as a interesting little proof of my point, and the connection to Newton, you can see here in Irving Fisher's treatise on economics. Irving Fisher was one of the great neoclassical economists, not the first, but he was very involved in making neoclassical economics highly mathematical. And in fact, if you try to read his textbook, as I did, without being schooled in math, you're going to have a real problem. But miraculously, this little table jumped out at me as I was scanning through the book online. And it kind of blew my mind, which is it proves that in his theory of economics, he was making an assertion that there was an analog, and there was an analog in economics to mechanics. And mechanics, what he was referring to is Newtonian physics. And of course, we've upgraded Newtonian physics several times since then, and economics has never been updated for the advances in physics, much less our understandings of how life works, living systems, as opposed to the foundational explanations we find in physics. So, for example, in Newtonian physics, a particle, according to Fisher, would correspond to the individual. So here's where this utility maximizing part comes from, is this assumption, and it was a mere assumption, that there was this analog between economic theory and Newtonian physics theory. And apparently the physicists at the time, when neoclassical economics was first developed, probably 100 years earlier, or 50 years earlier than Irving Fisher, they warned these political philosophers who were calling themselves economists that this made no sense. There was no logic found in physics that you could apply to something we call the economy. But not to be deterred, we built the entire theory of neoclassical economics on this one assumption, that there was an analog in economics to Newtonian physics. And there's a longer story here, but that led us to the awarding in 2018, not that long ago, of the Nobel Prize in Economics, which is not a legitimate Nobel, just as an aside. It's actually the Swedish Central Bank's prize in honor of Nobel, because Nobel was wise enough to understand that economics is actually not a science. But not to be deterred, the Swedish Central Bank, which is an extremely conservative economics ideological organization created a prize in honor of Nobel. And we now treat these as if they're Nobel Prizes. And believe it or not, in 2018, that prize was awarded to William Nordhaus for his work on climate change. And he's devoted decades of his career to thinking about the economics of climate change, and remarkably concluded that 3.5 degrees warming should be our goal, because anything lower would cost too much. And we could talk a long time about that, but one should draw the conclusion that in economics, we're literally lost, trapped in a dangerous fog of this neoclassical foundation. And because it's theoretical and complicated and mathematical, too few of us have actually gone into it and studied and grasped how profoundly flawed it is, and what the implications that flow out of that we often do not question. And so the symptoms that we do talk about, like grotesque inequality, and increasingly, I think, insecurity will be on the list right next to inequality. The amount of people living insecurely on this planet, whether it's physical security, health security, economic security, is undoubtedly a majority of the global population, depending on how one defines it. And it might be, some very large majority of the population. So we have created a system where most people, in fact, many very wealthy people, are insecure. They're worried about losing their wealth. And so we have a fundamentally unhealthy outcome that can trace its roots directly to neoclassical economics. But we also have the climate crisis and all of the interconnected ecological crises that are related. And this is a 2022 study by some very serious scientists, and they finally came out and said what many of them have been thinking for a long time. But scientists tend to be conservative about, raising alarms, because they don't want to say things. They don't want to assert some facts that haven't been proven scientifically. And so that's created an unfortunate bias in the scientific community that explains why now things are unraveling faster than the predictions that we previously were reading about. And this is pretty powerful language. The conditions will be far more dangerous than currently believed. The scale of the threats are so great, it's difficult to grasp for even well-informed experts. And we ask, what political or economic system or leadership is prepared to handle these predicted disasters, and much less capable of such action? And unfortunately, I don't mean this talk to be the doom and gloom talk, but we've entered a new phase here where these statements written only a year ago are coming to fruition much faster than probably they thought they would when they wrote those a year ago. Now, again, as most of you know, climate is just one of many of the planetary boundaries. I'm not going to go into that here. If you're not familiar with the Planetary Boundaries framework, I highly recommend studying it. The Stockholm Resilience Center is the source of this. But the point is, we're breaking multiple thresholds that are ecological in nature, because the metabolism of our human economy has continued to expand beyond the capacity of the natural resources and natural waste sinks to handle it. Now, the thinking through what is the root cause of this and what to do about this is the question of the moment. And how we think about it is, again, one of these issues that we don't spend time talking about. And as a result of the scientific revolution, the analytical, reductionist, mechanistic approach to solving problems has become the accepted way to address these things. And the scientific method is obviously brilliant and good at many, many things. But it is a reductionist approach where we break down things that are complicated into their parts and study the parts. And in the process, we lose an understanding and a connection to the whole. and a holistic approach, which is an alternative scientific method, much more aligned with our indigenous ways to think, is what is needed at this moment. If there is one fundamental idea of regenerative economics, it's we need to pull out of our reductionist way of thinking and couple it with a more holistic way of thinking. And Wes Jackson, who's one of my teachers, he does brilliant work at the Land Institute, perfecting the cultivation of perennial crops. Story for another day. He has some great one-liners, and he says there's nothing wrong with the reductionist method so long as we don't confuse the method with the way the world actually works. And where the chickens come home to roost here is in the distinction between what's complicated and what's complex. And what reductionist thinking is brilliant at is solving complicated problems, like how to fly into space, how to put a man on the moon, how to create a cell phone, how to create the internet. Anything that is a machine is a complicated problem to solve, from a bicycle to a supercomputer. But complexity is fundamentally different. And complexity is what describes how living systems work. Everything from our individual bodies, they are complex. And so the analog to regenerative economics is regenerative or holistic health, as opposed to a Western, the Western medical paradigm of expertise in certain, we have bone experts and heart experts and liver experts. And of course, you want those experts if you have some serious illness, but our health will be limited if we don't have a more holistic approach to our health. And any living system, from our bodies to our families, to our communities, to the United Nations, to a business organization, to a government organization, to the whole global economy, is actually a complex challenge, not a complicated challenge. And yet we're not trained in managing complexity. In fact, the truth is, complexity experts will tell us you don't actually manage complexity at all. You learn to work with it, you learn to dance with it. And yet we're trying to manage these problems as if they're merely complicated problems. And we're looking for solutions, silver bullets often, but solutions to our problems, as opposed to learning to work with the complexity of the interconnected, interdependent living systems. Now, in complexity science, there's something called a phase shift transition. And a simple example of that is you put a pot of water on the stove, you turn up the heat, and eventually it goes from, if it's a block of ice, eventually it will melt. That's a phase shift transition from solid to liquid. And if you keep the heat on longer, eventually it will boil. And the second phase shift is to a gaseous state. And I suggest that we are actually living through, in a sense, a phase shift transition. The last one of comparable magnitude and impact was the shift between the medieval era and the modern era. And the worldview around the medieval era, and this is again a Western, I should say this is a Western perspective, but the reason why the Western perspective is so important here is that the Western perspective is what generated neoclassical economics, and neoclassical economics now permeates the entire world economy. So the Western perspective is, I'm using it not because it's right, but because it's so influential. When we shifted from the medieval era to the modern era, we shifted our thinking that, the worldview, the metaphor would be God's design, and simplistically, the church had this special connection to God. The Pope had this special insights from the church, and if we wanted to go to heaven instead of hell, we better go to church every Sunday and listen to the Pope. And if we don't obey, we go to hell. And then again, the scientific revolution, Copernicus and all of his peers challenged that and said, well, wait a second, we can actually use our own agency to figure stuff out. And that's became the rise, the reductionist analytical method, the scientific method arose out of that. And suddenly we had a whole new way of understanding the world, an entirely new worldview. But it was grounded in this, what many call, dating to Newton, a clockwork universe, as if the world was a machine that we could understand by understanding the parts. And I think we're in the process, and imagine the chaos that it felt like when you went from the God's design era to a clockwork universe. It was obviously very threatening and challenging to the church, and I'm sure it felt very chaotic to people living at that time. And I feel we are living through a comparable shift, and that helps explain the chaos. Although the implications of this shift are absolutely more profound and important than the prior shift, because literally life on this planet for all species is now at stake, and that's never been the case before. Now, I don't know what future historians will call this new era. I'm somewhat provocatively calling it a regenerative era. A colleague of mine is convincing me that we should perhaps call it a unitive era, which I think is better. But I don't think we get to the unitive era unless we pass through a shift to regenerative thinking, to living systems-based thinking. And so I've spent a lot of time thinking about theory. And most people in the midst of a crisis don't want to think about theory. They want to, show me where the hoses are so I can fight the fires. And I get that, and that's important. But I would suggest that by jumping to action without grasping the theoretical foundation of the system and dealing with it at root causes, we're missing the genuine solutions that don't create bigger problems in the process. And what I think Einstein means by this theory is what determines what we're able to see, is that it's not only that seeing is believing. So all of you entrepreneurs out there, and I totally respect this more than I can even say, build new models and show people solutions, and then they will follow. That's absolutely true. But the opposite is also true. Not only is seeing believing, but believing is seeing. So if we have a belief system that we never interrogate, we never question, we don't realize how it affects how we actually see the problems we're trying to solve. And I think that's what Einstein was getting at here. So despite living in the midst of the chaos, I think we need to pause and get clear on what a more functioning and accurate theory of economics might look like. And so with my colleagues, we developed this theory now probably, or this definition probably 8 years ago, and always open to changing it, but I haven't found a way to make it better than this in terms of what I'm trying to say. Regenerative economics is the application of nature's laws. So the laws of physics, not just living systems. Living systems are in alignment with nature's laws, but also the patterns of systemic health, self-organization, self-renewal, and regenerative vitality that are all descriptions of how living systems work, not how just physics works, and apply those patterns and principles of systemic health to the design of our socioeconomic systems. And important to say socioeconomic systems, one of the reductionist splits that the economics profession chose was to split economics from politics. So we've sort of left we've decided, we in economics have decided our job is to figure out how to grow the pie, because the bigger pie is the source of our prosperity. And you guys over there in politics, you figure out how to divide the pie. That's not our problem. Well, it turns out you can't split those apart and end up with a rational outcome. So it's important to say what regenerative economics is not. It's not simply a new name for sustainability, as I was accused of about 10 years ago. It's not a political philosophy of the left or the right. And it's not an agriculture or a nature or environmental idea alone. And this is really important. Most people, I think today, when they hear the word regeneration or hear the concept of regenerative economics, they immediately put it in the bucket of, oh, that's an environmentalist. And Tay helped us with that by opening up with a nice little bit about trees. But regenerative economics is about the entire economy, not about just the quote nature part of the equation. And that's critically important to understand. So three premises that I built this theory on. One is that the human economy is a living system. And that's something we could debate, but that's a premise of regenerative economics. And if you don't buy that, then regenerative economics makes no sense. If you don't believe the human economy is a living system, though, I think it's incumbent upon you or us to make the case that it's not a living system. And I think we'll fail if we try to make that case. But that's an assertion. The human economy is a living system. The second premise is that there are patterns and principles that describe how all living systems that have sustained themselves, meaning they're living systems, not dead systems, how they actually work in the real world. That is actually an assertion that is factually correct. You can study ecology, you can study systems ecology, and you will not find 5 laws of ecology the way you can find in physics, but you will find an accepted consensus that there are patterns and principles that describe how living systems work. And the third premise arises from the first two. If our human economy is to sustainable, much less to thrive and to be healthy, which interestingly has the same root as the word whole, getting back to holistic thinking, over the long run, not over the next quarter or the next 10 years, over the long run, its system design must align with these same patterns and principles. That's the premise. And that is a, if there's one thing I'm passionate about, it's that simple statement of premise number 3. Now, what does it mean? I've done the best I can to, and now shifting into reductionist thinking, reductionist way of communicating, because we have a reductionist language called English that I'm trying to communicate in. So I've had to break down the complexity of living systems into as few as possible first principles to describe these patterns and principles of living system. And these are not the right 8 principles. They remarkably are, they're absolutely inadequate. But unless we add 8 more principles, and then you have something that's difficult to communicate, this is the best I can do. And I welcome enhancements to it. There are other ways of describing this. There are better ways of describing it in different contexts. For example, Janine Benyus has first principles that are more relevant to the material design world and the product design world. So for example, green chemistry is one of her principles, but for the economic system as a whole, I see green chemistry sitting within robust circulation. And we get into why I think that way when in the course. I won't have time to here today. So let me just pause there and well, just to circle back, you've read the names. Hopefully they trigger some thoughts in your mind. We can double click, and we do in the course, on each of these. And each of these has multiple layers of meaning that are difficult to articulate in a talk that I've been asked to give. And so the course has been the first opportunity to really delve into what these individual principles mean, and then more importantly, how they fit together into one whole, which is what they are. And one of the course participants interestingly pointed out to me that the number 8, first of all, has lots of meaning in Chinese culture, but secondly is an infinity sign on the side, turned sideways. And the essence of the regenerative paradigm is that if we align with living systems, there is infinite potential waiting to manifest itself that we can't yet see. And that has been the way life has evolved over the millennia, literally the millions and billions of years, is potential manifests out of this living systems design. And so my opinion, and this is just an opinion, is that the alternative to exponential extractive growth as the source of our future prosperity is to align with living systems and begin to manifest potential we don't yet see yet as the source of our prosperity. And that's why this framework I find personally so hopeful. And I think why people who have participated in the course come away feeling a new sense of hope grounded in scientific rigor, as opposed to some utopian, la la land ideas. So a couple comments about the course. As I've said, it's really about a new way of seeing, a new way of thinking, a new way of being individually. And so this is part of a personal transformation process that is absolutely happening and underway. But unfortunately, the institutions and individuals in positions of power are threatened by this, and it's not necessarily in their view, in their self-interest, to join this course. But it is the course we will take. Just as a pot of water boils, if you turn up the heat, the rising pressure will force this change on us, whether we invite it or not. So we may as well learn about it and work with it, dance with this complexity. The course is designed around really 3 pillars. One is good old-fashioned lectures and what we call discovery dialogues. These happen twice a week. Lectures on Monday, discovery dialogues on Wednesday. The dialogues are meant to unlock new insight. For those interested, I highly recommend reading David Bohm's On Dialogue to get a sense of what we mean by dialogue. It's very different than debate or a lot of the communication that is about one side trying to convince another side that they're right. We have what we call practice labs, which are our attempt to help during this 8-week very short course integrate the teachings from the lectures and making them concrete and tangible. Those happen on Wednesdays as well, in between the discovery dialogues. And then honestly, perhaps the most valuable piece of the course design is the community that is attracting to this course and the course cohorts. And as Tay mentioned, we're nearly at 1,000 people that have been through either the economics course, or now we're just about finishing the first finance course. And it's a brilliant, incredibly passionate and thoughtful group of people. I've learned so much from many of the participants, and I knew if I spent more time with the others, I would learn a tremendous amount there as well. And so if I can say one thing about the value of the course, it's to connect with people in this community that are intuiting the same things and find this living systems frame a fresh and hopeful way to look at the chaos that's surrounding us. It's not just me. We have, now that we're about to start the 4th cohort, we have a number of recorded discovery dialogues that are all available to each of the new cohorts, as well as a few fresh live ones. But there's just tremendous insight that can be gleaned from the dialogues that are part of the curriculum now with these people you're looking at and others that we can't fit on the slide. The course curriculum you'll find on the course landing page, but just in very brief, after an introduction and a double click on this problem with neoclassical economics, we spend 2 weeks talking about this shift from reductionism to holism and double clicking on the 8 principles. That's the foundation of not just the course, but I believe think of it as a compass we should use when we try to address all aspects of the global economy, whether it's the agriculture industry or the real estate industry or finance or technology. Those principles are first principles of how life works. And those are what we will learn to apply in all different contexts, from our own individual lives to the global economy. We then do a session on what in conventional economics would be called microeconomics. We talk about the firm, whether it's a business or any kind of organization. How is it that our business enterprises can move in the direction of becoming regenerative, becoming more like living systems? And my colleagues at In Rhythm have a great way of describing this. We at heart is learning how to create the conditions for health inside organizations, just like we want to create the conditions for health inside or within our own bodies. We then do a week on macroeconomics and what I'll call meta-economics. I'm borrowing that from one of my teachers, E.F. Schumacher. but that's in a sense the macro aspect of thinking about living systems on a systemic level across the whole global economy and the institutions of the macro economy, like central banks and government organizations. We do a bit on philanthropy there as well. Actually, no, we do philanthropy in the finance section. In week 6, most people think of me as a finance guy, and so they confuse this course as a finance course. It's not. It's an economics course. But we do spend 1 week talking about finance and applying these principles to the financial system and to our finance ideology, which is absolutely at the heart of our problems here, in my opinion. And then we talk about leadership and the challenges of being a leader in this shift in paradigms to a living systems paradigm, and hint or spoiler alert: leadership is not something to be left to our leaders. All of us need to take ownership and agency for leadership in this shift to a regenerative era. And then we have a final week where we wrap it up and hopefully reconnect this quite scientific approach to an economy with the ageless and timeless wisdom of all of our ancient wisdom traditions, not just indigenous, but Eastern, Southeast Asian. It's incredible how the living systems principles that you can learn in ecology were intuited by all of the great wisdom traditions. So we try to wrap it up together in that. And we've had lots of interesting people from different organizations join the course. There's no logo for the majority, who are people who are in this search. I don't have the data on this, but I suspect that if you were to pick one group of people and try to define them, they are people who have recently quit their jobs and are in search for something more meaningful and aligned with their values and relevant to the polycrisis that's cascading around them, or they're people that are on the verge of quitting their job. In fact, one of the KPIs, if you will, of the course that I'd like to track is how many people do quit their job after they take the course. So if that sounds like you, then I think this course is for you. I'm really honestly very proud of the feedback we're getting, particularly when it relates to young people who, as this person is saying, walk away from this course energized and excited and not depressed and overwhelmed. Now, just to remind us all that nothing I'm saying here or teaching is new. Buckminster Fuller, in his really, it's kind of his farewell message to humanity. He wrote a short little book called Grunch, which most people, including me, had never heard of. It is his critique of capitalism, believe it or not, written in the early 1980s. I think it was published literally the year he died. And you can imagine my surprise when I read this, just a few years ago. Right at the end of the book, he says, nature is a totally efficient, self-regenerating system. If we discover the laws that govern this system, the patterns and principles, and live synergistically within them, sustainability will follow and humankind will be a success. And if you read his book, what you would clearly understand as well is that there was a message there that if we don't do that, humankind will not be a success. So this is serious business. I think we all intuit that, but we're at the point where we better get on with the business at hand and reconnecting, understanding, re-educating ourselves, and reconnecting with how life works is the essence of this course and the journey that will begin in this just an introductory course, but the real work happens in how we then learn to apply it and use our own expertise, our own essence as individuals to make this part of the economy we're trying to invent as we fly the plane, if you will. So hopefully I got through that. Oh, I talked too long, as I always do. I apologize for that, but hopefully we have some time for some either comments or questions, both very much welcome.
Yeah, if anyone has any questions, you could go ahead and raise your hand and we'd be happy to call on you.
I talked too long. I apologize.
I have a question, John. This is Stuart Valentine.
Hey, Stuart.
Good day. I saw on the very last slide that you had Danone, Walmart, Nestle. This is, remember Chris Laszlo's book, Embedded Sustainability?
I do.
I see this testimonial. It's very encouraging to me to see these are major multinational corporations who have invited you in to teach on regenerative economics. And I'm just curious what your experience is. Is this because, I think right now in the ESG movement, we're all up against the greenwashing claim and anti-ESG, but then I see signs of companies like this inviting you in to teach. And I'm curious what your experience is inside the big belly of the beast.
Yeah, well, it's not as hopeful as maybe that slide might have indicated.
Uh-huh.
Those are logos of companies that have sent people to the course. They're not companies that have invited me in to, lecture their boards of directors. And I'd have to say, honestly, this is really hard to reconcile with the demands and stresses and challenges of certainly a public corporation. Perhaps impossible. But I think, I used the opening testimonial from a quite senior guy at Patagonia. Obviously, sustainability is not new to Patagonia. And even for someone inside that culture and organization, they walked away saying this gave them a new way of seeing that they can't unsee. So, what I would say about the big corporations is I will be going for the second year to give a kind of an opening keynote-ish talk at Sustainable Brands. And what I think, and that's the big brands, but it's the sustainability professionals inside the big brands. And the reason I agreed to go last year is that I was convinced that, you're not speaking to companies, you're speaking to human beings who are inside companies fighting the good fight. And can you imagine how frustrating it must be to be the chief sustainability officer of Walmart or Danone, or even the companies we associate with being the good guys. And so I do believe that that using the 8 principles as a compass to wrestle with their challenges would be profoundly impactful, but they're not going to like the answers that come out of that, as you can well appreciate. And I think that, I think this is not by any means the next great trend in corporate sustainability. This is reality check time. And Walmart, God bless them, has publicly announced they want to become a regenerative company. But how you transform a business like that to being a truly regenerative company, systemically regenerative, is beyond my pay grade.
Stuart, I'm going to hop in real quick here and just take this opportunity to share my thoughts on that process. John, nice to meet you.
Hi, Quinn. Yeah, jump in.
I work for a company called Arva Intelligence, and what we're attempting to do is originate the claims, the environmental assets that these companies, Walmart, Danone, Nestle, are purchasing and investing in to drive change at the field level, specifically in agriculture, whether that's ranching and or row crop agriculture around the United States and the world. And I think where a lot of the struggle is for them, because they do want to be making change in this space, that's something that we sense very clearly, is that there's huge demand, but the educational gap in understanding what John's teaching here is just huge, and we're constantly butting up against that lack of just understanding and trying to meet in the middle where we're driving solutions that makes sense to them right now, and maybe it's just around carbon or reducing carbon footprint at this point, but we need to be thinking about a more holistic way to track success, measure that and value that, and then get these companies educated on how to drive that investment at the field level. So it's a big battle ahead, but there is, like John said, plenty of hope, and there are a lot of people that are doing the good work to move that forward.
The only other thing, and Mahmoud, I apologize, I'll get to you in 1 second. The only other thing I'd add is that any company, no matter what business they're in, including oil and gas companies, can learn to behave more as a living organism and create conditions for health inside their organization. And I would predict that if Exxon learned how to be a regenerative company at a cultural level, they would unlock, new business opportunities that they currently don't see, and new ways to use their skills and their people that they're blinded to today because they define themselves as being an oil and gas company. And the most interesting suggestion that we in the sustainability world can throw at them is, you should put up wind farms. Well, turns out that putting up wind farms probably has nothing to do with petroleum engineering. And so it may be that it would be stupid for Exxon to start putting up wind farms. But there's a fascinating application of deep drilling technology with ultra deep geothermal. And it turns out one of the founders of the leading companies is an ex oil and gas engineer. So if companies learn to think holistically and use living systems as a guide, and it would take too long to explain why I'm saying this, but I am highly confident that they would unlock potential for new constructive business opportunities that could displace what they're currently doing and give them a pathway toward the future. So, Mahmoud, you've been waiting patiently. I apologize. Jump on in.
No. Thanks, John. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My question has two parts. Part A, how does regenerative economy relate to a stakeholder economy? And part B, how would you differ regenerative economy with new economy ideas such as conscious capitalists, natural capitalists, and sustainable capitalists, and more? There are different flavors.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you.
It's a great question, and the most important thing I want to say is that I'm not proposing this as an alternative to or better than these other ideas. What I truly believe is that if regenerative economics is, let's use the word true, if it's accurate, it will embrace and hold all of these other ideas as a part of it. So it's easiest to describe, circular economy as, that fits neatly within one of our 8 principles. The principle is robust circulation. So think of, a living system has a metabolism. But circular economy is primarily focused on energy and matter, or energy matter. Well, it turns out that the way I propose the metabolism of the economy has to include more than just energy and matter. It has to include information. It has to include empathy. Maybe let's even add the word consciousness to segue into your other part of your question. And so how does that happen? Well, turns out this little innovation called the internet is brilliant at enabling the circulation of information and even empathy. And so the innovation of the internet is probably the most regenerative thing that's happened in my lifetime. And yet we think of the internet, well, we think of it in a positive way. I assume most people do, but then we immediately associate it with Facebook and Google and all of these problems. But the problem isn't the internet. The problem is that the business model of these companies is profoundly extractive. And so again, there are layers of regenerative thinking, one of which is the product and service, one of which is the capital structure of the company, and one of which is the culture of the company. And all of these need to be aligned with the living systems principles if the outcome is to be regenerative. Now, stakeholder capitalism, I think is a great advance toward shifting away from shareholder primacy. It fits in my framework. I have this expression, holistic wealth. That's another way of saying stakeholder capitalism. The trouble with stakeholder capitalism is we haven't figured out a way to actually do what we say. It's sort of shareholder capitalism with a bunch of add-ons, but when push comes to shove, it's still shareholder capitalism. So in theory or in description, it's a piece of the whole, but it isn't the answer, right? It's in my way of thinking, it's one of 8 principles. It's not the answer. And the conscious capitalism movement is even more interesting. But I'm sure there's a lot of people in the conscious capitalism movement who are aligned with my thinking. But there's a lot of people who talk about conscious capitalism who are not at all questioning neoclassical economics. So it's not enough to sort of be in favor of higher consciousness behavior without wrestling with the systemic design that's generating the problems. So again, I see conscious, there's a lot to say about this, but I see it as a piece of a bigger whole as opposed to an either or, if that makes sense. You have to come join the course to get the full
Thank you.
sense of it. There's a lot to say there and a lot to discuss together.
Thank you.
Robert, jump in.
Yeah, hi John, thanks. It's so exciting to hear this, so thanks very much for the presentation. I was just wondering, where are you seeing and do you expect to see the greatest traction in living systems and regenerative economics in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think for sure in agriculture. I think it's already happening. It's agriculture in many ways should be understood as the foundation, and agriculture more broadly defined than we typically think of it. But the way we manage the landscape broadly defined, because like it or not, most of the land on this planet is now privately it's controlled by someone, either a government or an individual or a company. And how we interact with that land, there's no, agriculture and maybe the built environment are the 2 areas where we have the most direct interaction with the land. And we need to think of that as the foundation layer of the economy, which if we don't get that right, doesn't matter what happens above it. And so that I think is the answer to the question. The challenge I think we all have is to not reduce regenerative economics to regenerative agriculture. So,
yeah. And are you saying, I mean, I'd probably have to come on the course to see this, is there a business case for regenerative economics, and is it one that people are listening to and seeing?
So I hate that question.
Yeah, I know, but it's kind of, that's one way that we transition, isn't it?
I know. My response to what's the business case is, and I know you mean it in completely, I totally understand why you're asking and what you're asking, but my response is, what's the sustainability case for your business? And I think, but to be less glib, absolutely there is a business case conventionally understood for many, many new innovations, and I'm invested in several. I can defend them to the cows come home. But there's also going to be a very ugly reality setting in that, I mean, people have analyzed this. If you internalize the externalities using any simple back of the envelope method, the entire, global economy loses money.
Yeah,
that's the reality. So now what do we want to do? And so I think massive turmoil is in store for many, many companies. And the trouble with the whole sustainability conversation and the ESG conversation is that we're not saying that. We're pretending there's a win-win and we can just do this without making some really tough choices. And that I hope we will not deceive anyone with the lack of need to make hard choices.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
yeah. Do we have any female questions? One of the things I'm really intrigued about in the course, I don't have the data on this because we don't ask people what their gender is, but I would guess there's 2/3 of the people in the course, maybe not quite, are female versus male. And there's something about feminine intuition, feminine energy that is much more attuned to this and aligned with this and grogs this. So at any rate, I would love to there's one, Paula, bring your voice into this conversation. Nothing against us men. We're doing the best we can.
Interesting conversation thus far. Sorry, no video right now, just audio, if that's okay.
Okay.
My question would have to be with, since you brought up the different ways of viewing systems, systems change and applying it to economics, how you're applying in this course and in the way that you view regenerative economics, the qualities and characteristics of new leadership, of regenerative leadership, and any models or frames that you're working on. Have you incorporated models like those that are discussed in ULab or in the Inner Development Goals?
So great question.
Building.
Yeah, great question. So I am a student of Otto Scharmer's, and I've participated in not the full formal ULab, but I would say his work is very much has very much influenced my thinking, and honestly helped me understand my own journey as much as anything. You know, there's a guy named Sander Tiedemann who I saw is here today. I don't see him now, but he's got a great book that I'd highly recommend. There he is. Sander, tell us the name of your book. I'm forgetting it.
Hi, John. It's great listening to you. Triple Value Leadership.
So there you go. There's one recommendation. Honestly, I don't consider myself a leadership expert. In fact, I have resisted talking about leadership until this year. In the first cohort, I invited Laura Storm to do the leadership lecture. She and Giles Hutchings have a wonderful book on regenerative leadership that I'd also recommend. She also has a year-long course on it. But I decided to sort of put my own, wrinkle on it, and so I do have an emerging framework, which is I would say a complement to Otto Scharmer's work, and honestly, I found both Laura and Sander's work, as well as the work of In Rhythm, my colleagues at In Rhythm, to be the sources of my learning. But I guess if another way of answering your question, what's unique or different about what I will say about leadership, what I find fascinating is some work done in the area of addiction and trauma, and I think that what shall I say briefly? I think the connection to consciousness is where we recognize that. Well, let me back up and say something. I think we're all in trauma because of our economic system. And many of our responses are similar to other addictions. We're trying to turn off the negative energy, shame, guilt, fear that comes with trauma in order to experience higher consciousness energy. And so my thinking that I'll share on leadership is related to how leaders need to model and demonstrate higher consciousness forms of being as a way to attract energy more than some newfangled, here's how you manage complexity with, you know, KPIs and mechanistic approaches. It's much more about learning to be a higher consciousness leader. And maybe that's a way that it links into the conscious capitalism movement that someone had earlier asked about.
So when you're
Sandra
referring
has
to
a
that
beautiful
section of the course,
diagram that elevates you know, wisdom as a criteria or as an ingredient that all enterprises need to wrestle with. And you know, we're all ignorant right now. We're really good at managing complicated, and yet the challenge is complexity. And so to assume that the CEO of any company is going to be able to do that on their own is completely insane. And so it's about pulling together different skill sets and energies to help guide an organization into this future unknown reality. There's a long answer to a short, good question.
so that particular section in the course does a survey of different frames for capacity building of leadership skills, or do you just present a history of them?
I don't want to overstate. It's 1 week, 1 lecture. I wouldn't say we do a survey. I would say I present some thoughts on it, and then and some frameworks that I've either developed or borrowed that hopefully will be helpful. But it's by no means a comprehensive survey of alternative leadership methodologies.
You might want to look into the Inner Development Goals framework for development.
Yeah,
of
I'm familiar with that. I know at least one of the founders of that, and you're right. I should spend time. I'm not up to date on where they've taken that, so thanks for.
Otto Scharmer is part of that group, and if you're looking for Frederick, we can connect afterwards about if you'd like more information. They're working on a survey, which might be of interest.
I'm blanking on the guy's name right now. I apologize, but I've been to the island where he conducts his. He's a fellow member of the Club of Rome, so I'm quite familiar with him.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Stefan.
Hey, John.
And by the way, you know, we're well over the time limit. I'm happy to keep chatting, but if people are needing to jump off, please do. I appreciate your spending this much time. And you know, the information about the course is, you know, because you signed up for this webinar, you're probably going to get overwhelmed with emails. I apologize for that, but that's how it works. But obviously it's all the information you need is on the Capital Institute website as well.
Great. John, a quick question for you regarding the course. I was speaking to a graduate of the course last week. I'm involved in a startup right now, and we have an open source framework where we take in the best thinking possible. And when this graduate heard what we were doing, she said, you know, I think you should pursue a regenerative business model for your startup as a way to illustrate to both the financial markets and the corporate marketplace. These are two markets we're serving with our technology platform as a way of doing business, you know, in a way that's very healthy, holistic, and everything that you talked about. And I'm wondering, during the course, will I be able to pick up on certain tenets that will enable me to incorporate and build a regenerative business model? Because the more I spoke to her about it, the more I realized, and knowing your work the way I do, that this would be something I would like to showcase to other companies that I will be, talking to and integrating with, and see whether or not I can stir up as an adjunct their desire to pursue something like this.
Yeah, no, I mean, 100%. Put it this way, if you come and join the course community and don't walk away with, I just lost you, are you still there? Huh. Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
You sort of went away all of a sudden. I thought maybe you'd.
Oh, sorry.
If we don't give you conceptual frameworks, practical approaches, tools, then we have failed, because this is
Okay.
not an academic course for the sake of having a conversation. I'm tempted to share an announcement that I'm not privy to make yet, but put it this way, that there is a plan on our side to make more concrete, practical experiences for people who are building companies or who are trying to change companies to collaborate together. So, the old model is hire a consultant, come into your company. We're not going to do that unless you're Walmart. We'll probably figure out a way to do that. But imagine being part of a cohort of 10 companies that are all different, but all, one of my sayings in the course is about living systems is that every snowflake is unique, but every snowflake looks like a snowflake. And so the idea of these living systems principles is they are first principles, meaning they apply to everything. It's just the context is always different. So the challenge is to apply it into your context in your company. And that's hard. But I have found, looking at lots and lots of companies and projects around the world, you'd be amazed at how they are the same thing in a different shell. And the principles show up, even though they don't talk about the principles. You can see the principles in what they're doing. So absolutely, my hope, honestly, is the only way to leverage what I'm doing is for people like you to embrace it and manifest it, and not only for within your company, but then with all of the companies that you trade with and exchange with. So that's absolutely that's plan A. That's why I'm doing this.
Yeah, that's the goal. I mean, that's really the goal on my part is, and that's why I made the platform open source, is because I wanted to bring in the best thinking, but then after bringing it in is to move it out, into our verticals, and to show people this is not only going to be good for you from a financial perspective, but it's going to change the way you operate, and it's going to bring people to your company, both from a customer perspective, a stakeholder perspective, an employee perspective, that's going to give you that long-lasting benefit, right?
Yeah, totally.
That,
I mean, just the employee, using old speak, the employee retention issue alone makes this going back to is there a business case? There's an overwhelming business case to create an organization where people actually are thriving and want to come to work, and that alone will differentiate you from the majority of companies out there. And so, and that, as I said earlier, that's true no matter what industry you're in. So forget about your supply chain metrics and greening, Just Trey Cates, who's the founder of InRhythm, figured out that people spend most of their time at work. So if you want to improve people's lives, you better start with improving the quality of life inside the company they work in. And of course, just drawing on my old background, I mean, Wall Street's really good at doing exactly the opposite of that. And the only reason that it still exists is that they can extract so much from the economy that they can afford to pay people a lot to put up with it. But it's completely degenerative, destructive, and unsustainable in the long run, in my opinion. Anyone else? We get back to our summer times. Well, I'll just say in wrapping up, thank you again for your time and interest in this. Please reach out to my team if you have more questions. I see lots in the chat. I haven't been able to read it. I do see Rianne Eisler's name, absolutely, one of my teachers. I'll look forward to reading the chat when we get done. But I do hope you'll join our community. And I do that not because I'm trying to flog ticket sales, but because of all the things that I could think of working on. If I thought there was something more important, I'd be working on it. I think this is kind of ground zero for the transformation that we're embarking on. And if that's true, then this course is one of the primary ways that I'm using to bring that to more and more people. So hope to see you in the fall cohort. And there is a finance course for those of you that are in finance. The logic, it makes more sense to do the econ course first. It's much more of a broad overview, and then in a sense double click on the finance topic, as well as leadership. And there'll be more course offerings coming in the years to come. In fact, we're working on a course on regenerative technology with a technologist as we speak, which is the big missing link in the offering we have right now, I would say. Hey, what have I missed?
We covered it all, John.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. Have an awesome rest of your day, evening. Thanks for joining us. Follow up with any questions. Hope to see you all soon.
Great conversation. Thank you.